So this afternoon I'm going to talk about two neighbourhoods which effectively became one in the end, which is Silsbridge Lane and Goitside. So I'm going to start by talking about Silsbridge Lane. Now, more or less Grattan Road and Silsbridge Lane are interchangeable. They are one in the same, but there is a reason why the name was changed. But that is the area we are talking about today to begin with, so the Grattan Road area. So, Silsbridge Lane. Right, Silsbridge refers to a bridge that was constructed across the Bradford Beck. So the Bradford Beck is near Thornton Road. So that was one of the boundaries that used to mark the old Bradford Township and the old Horton Township. So what we now call Lister Hills was in Horton Township. And it was, so basically the bridge was quite an old bridge, that was part of an old packhorse trail that went from Bradford to Halifax. In the 1820s, Thornton Road was constructed, and that basically built over the old bridge. The theory is that the sill in Silsbridge means edge or connection. So I suppose you're on the edge of Bradford, that sort of idea. And it's thought that the old bridge is still underneath Thornton Road. So they basically just built the road over. So today we refer to the road as Grattan Road, and I will come in a while to the reasons why the name was changed. So the original Silsbridge Lane is the higher part of the two roads, between City Road and Westgate, sort of that end of what we now call Grattan Road. That's where it began. And so during the 19th century, industry begins to develop around this area, and what you get was what we call a ribbon development along this road. So that's basically where you get the developments of houses and other buildings that follow the roads rather than expand out beyond the area. So I suppose thinking of examples of ribbon developments, perhaps Thornton Village is a bit like that, really. It seems to sort of be made. And then from where I live, sort of my neck of the woods places. Has anybody ever been to Horton in Ribblesdale? Yeah. That's definitely one where it's just, you have a road that winds and pretty much all the houses are built in and slightly off it. So it was that sort of thing. The area, now I've said like all other new neighbourhoods in Bradford, but actually the point is Silsbridge Lane it's thought it was probably the first neighbourhood that was built in the area. And like the others after it, it was made up of densely packed back-to-back terraced houses. No meaningful sanitation, no clean water. It was also an area that had a really, really bad reputation that developed very quickly for drunkenness, crime, antisocial behaviour, that sort of thing. I suppose a bit like Bradford today, really. 1836, in order to do something about this social problem, there is a Baptist church that gets founded in the area, but it very quickly fails because about 30% of its members are expelled for various things: drunkenness, fornication, immorality. By the 1840s, the health conditions in this area were so bad that the average death age was 18.69 years old. And if you were a woolcomber, it was under 15 years old that you were likely to die. So it wasn't a very healthy environment to live in. There wasn't any sewage or drainage systems in Bradford until the 1850s. And you had massive overcrowding in this little area, so disease became rife. And very quickly Silsbridge Lane became a slum area. High levels of crime, high levels of antisocial behaviour, and it was regarded as the most notorious district of Bradford. It was also very, very Irish Catholic. A bit like Longlands that we talked about last week up the hill. In fact, you could almost say that it was exclusively Irish Catholic. It seems as though the nature of the population was so much that way. And we'll go a little bit more detail in a minute. So you could put some of this down as being discrimination as well, because of, obviously if there's anti-Irish Catholic sentiment from people in Bradford, then things are going to get exaggerated, things may get made up. Extremely poor conditions of Silsbridge Lane are captured in the Bradford Woolcombers report of 1845. This is like a modern reprint of that. They were inspecting conditions across all these different new districts in Bradford at the time. So one observer said that during the daytime, when most of the residents were at work, the streets would swarm with sickly-looking children of various ages and degrees of raggedness. I mean, anybody with any sort of, empathy would think, poor children. It was almost as though they were accusing the children of, how dare you be poor, It feels a bit like that reading it. But from 11 o'clock in the morning till midnight on Saturdays, you get crowds of men appearing in the streets, fighting, swearing and carousing. So it was regarded as a bit of a problem area, was Silsbridge Lane. And then another author, James Burnley, in his 1871 book, Phases of Bradford Life, he visits Silsbridge Lane. He actually visits Silsbridge Lane a few times, and the way he sums up Silsbridge Lane is he calls it an Irish colony. He talks about the environmental conditions. He says it's filthy in the streets, there's foul smells from the properties. He talks about a lot of anti-English behaviour from the residents, a lot of I suppose you'd call it Irish nationalist literature and rants and so on, which probably a lot of people wouldn't have dared do in other parts of Bradford for fear of reprisal, or perhaps fear of the police coming along and doing something. He talks about the local shops in the neighbourhood being dingy and dilapidated, the houses being overcrowded. He's not got really anything positive to say about the area at all. I mean, maybe he was going in with a bit of an agenda. He visited on a Saturday evening. He had 2 policemen escorting him. And he said it was extremely noisy. There was mass drunkenness in the streets. Although he does concede that, although some of it, people are very bitter and angry, and it seems to be a very anti-English sentiment that's being expressed, equally you get a lot of men who are jovial and happy and want to come along and say, hello, how are you, who are you, welcome to our neighbourhood. So it is a bit of a mix, but I think overall though he still complains about the behaviour of people in the streets. And he refers to Silsbridge Lane in his book as a forbidden place, which I would take means it's a no-go area, basically. So, as well as Silsbridge Lane probably being the first neighbourhood built in Bradford with the Industrial Revolution, it was also the first no-go area in Bradford. So, right, despite the conditions in the area, there were never really any proposals for slum clearance, and the area was definitely had become a slum quickly. As we talked about last week, Longlands up the hill was the first neighbourhood eventually to be declared insanitary and cleared in the early 20th century. But they had different ideas about Silsbridge Lane. They just decided to widen the road instead, and that meant that you had to remove buildings as part of the process, so many dwellings disappeared from the area. And then the road was renamed Grattan Road, and as far as I can tell, this was in honour of Henry Grattan, who was a member of Parliament. He was an Irish nationalist member of Parliament. So I think there was probably a nod towards the population of the area in that respect. I also think, though, there was an attempt to rebrand the area, because Silsbridge Lane as a name had become so notorious, so anti-English. So this is a no-go area, that if you change the name and you call it something else, perhaps it's like a fresh start, you know. So it became Grattan Road instead. I don't quite know what happened to people whose homes were to be demolished. I doubt very much there would have been much in the way of help for them. I don't know whether they just ended up homeless. From that point on, really, once Grattan Road had been widened, the area essentially became part of a wider area, which is basically what we would call Goitside, and that's what we're going to now move on to. So it was significant in that it was probably the first of the neighbourhoods to emerge as a result of the Industrial Revolution coming to Bradford. But like a number of neighbourhoods in Bradford, it didn't last, and you know, some of them lasted much longer, like into the 20th century, but some places this did disappear during the 19th century. So, Goitside. The name of Goitside refers to the presence of a goit, or a leat. This is basically an artificial channel taking water from Bradford Beck to power a water mill, then returning it back to the natural watercourse at a lower level. So it's a bit like, just as a canal is a man-made structure, a goit or a leat is a man-made structure. It's like an artificial river. Well, it's not really a river, is it? Because there's an hierarchy. But it's an artificial beck or an artificial stream. So the goit, the artificial channel, is thought to be medieval in origin. So we're talking pre-industrial revolution, and that it used to power corn mills in Bradford that were. It was connected with the manor, basically, at Bradford, and the rights that the manor had. And really, it was because of the goit that industry first developed in this particular area of Bradford. So you've got the beck and you've got the goit, and of course, mills will require water for power. So it sort of makes logical sense that they would be set up in this particular region of Bradford. So first mill that we developed was Home Mill in the area. I think the next one was Thompson's Mill, I think. And again, it was sort of Silsbridge Lane, Goitside area that these things were put up. This is the area we're roughly talking about. So that's Thornton Road at the bottom. So that's the bottom of the valley. That's Godwin Street. I think this is a bit of Westgate, and then down Grattan Road, along Sunbridge Road to City Road, and then down to that meet Thornton Road again. Now, that's been my general take of the area, but it's not the only official designation for Goitside is the conservation area, which has come into existence in more recent times. So there's obviously a boundary for that, but that's different to this. It's a bit wider to this. Some people sometimes, this is Longlands, which is up there, and quite often that gets lumped in as well.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Or people call it Upper Goitside rather than Goitside. Come up, yeah. Change Street area, yeah, basically. But it's so distinctly different to the rest of this, with the tenement blocks and the houses around there compared to the rest of this, which is basically, warehouses and mill buildings. And you can just tell, when you're walking along, that it's different there to there.
So that's following the water flow down Thornton Road?
Yes.
Down from the Fillers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, this general area was the first to be developed with the Industrial Revolution. and took advantage of there being reliable sources of water. So the late 18th, early 19th century, that this was the area that it was starting to happen, as where other parts of Bradford, even fairly close by, remained relatively rural. So this morning we were talking about Broomfields district and how it was sort of 1840s before Broomfields actually started to get development in it. So for quite a while, whilst stuff was going on at this part of Bradford, the rest of Bradford was staying largely untouched. Housing was built in the area. There's a lot less of it today, but Goitside was primarily a commercial district, I would say, and often in literature it's referred to as the industrial engine of Bradford, because it seemed to be the main area where things were made. You got, most well-known industrialists had premises in Goitside. Sir Titus Salt is probably the most well-known of those who had a presence in the area. So during his early period, he worked with his father's wool stapling business, Daniel Salt and Son, and that was on Thornton Road. And then, of course, he's more famous for his later interest that combined business and social ideas, his philanthropy, and ended up him deciding that he wanted to build a model urban village like lots of industrialists were doing at the time all over the country, particularly over the north, and that later became Saltaire in Shipley. Now, a slight aside, Saltaire, just because we're talking about it, did you know that Salt did not originally want to build Saltaire in Shipley? It looks, from what I've read, as though he originally wanted to build it in Skipton. I live just outside of Skipton now. Is anybody familiar with Skipton?
Yeah.
Okay. Down, right, at the top of the high street, there's the parish church and the castle. Bottom of the high street, there, just beyond it, there is an area called Newtown. Except if you were to ask people in Skipton, where is Newtown, they'd look at you these days and say, where? Because it's one of these areas that's fallen out of use. And beyond that is a very big neighbourhood called Middletown, which is mostly terraced houses, and where most of the industry really happened in Skipton. But at the time that Salt went to Skipton, Skipton was really still a tiny rural market town compared to what it is today. All of that area was not developed, and the policy of the manor at the time was if they were to sell any of their land or lease any of their land, it was not for industrial development, it would be for other things instead. That changed later on, but at the time it was like, sorry, and I often wonder what it would have been like if Saltaire had actually been built in Skipton rather than in Shipley. Because Middletown is okay, but you could be absolutely anywhere in Yorkshire when you're wandering around Middletown. There's these really long streets of terraced houses. He's also thought to have looked at a few other sites, one in Burley and Wharfdale and one in Knaresborough. And I think probably with all the sites he looked at, one of the things would have been being close to either water or where the canal network was going. So obviously in Skipton, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal go through what is now Middletown, that area. So it would have been a really good spot for him to have built Saltaire. And I guess the wharf, Burley and Wharfdale, and what is it in Knaresborough? What's the river that goes through the middle? It's quite broad. The Nid. What it's thought is that a major reason that he didn't want to build his model urban village in Bradford was Bradford Corporation was talking about introducing a business rate of some sort. Now back then it was a bit different with rates. There was no distinction between domestic rates and commercial rates. There was just general rates. But I think it was up to the policy of each municipal corporation as to what they charged and how they worked it out and that sort of thing. And I don't know the ins and outs, but I would imagine that there would have been, particularly considering that there were so many business interests that actually were elected onto Bradford Council. You had so many councillors who had business interests or property interests. I would imagine as much as possible they would have tried to either not charge businesses rates or charge them as little as they could get away with. Now 1847 I think it was, Bradford, Horton, Bowling and Manningham all merged together and formed the new borough of Bradford. And I wonder whether Salt thought that perhaps Shipley was a little bit too close by and maybe it might be next, you know, coming along. But anyway, in the end, he settled, obviously, for the site that his, you know, Saltaire is. So back to Goitside. So, by the latter part of the 19th century, surprise, surprise, it's a slum area, like all the other areas that we've talked about so far. And it also developed a poor reputation as a place to avoid. And from the research that I've done, this seems to have lasted well into the 20th century. When I interviewed residents who lived in Longlands, they talked about men being drunk and fighting in the streets in Goitside. Like Silsbridge Lane and Longlands, the Goitside area was predominantly Irish Catholic. So again, there is the question of whether a lot of this poor reputation that lasted, it could be down to discrimination. It could be a bit of a mix of reality and that. 1873, Silsbridge Road is built, and this results in many dwellings being lost, and a tram line was built which ran along there into the town centre. More recently, you might have seen in the local press that when work was done on Silsbridge Road, they discovered some of the old tram lines. We interviewed some residents who'd actually lived around this bit of Goitside, near the Lord Clyde. Two of them were of Irish Catholic descent, and they lived in terraced houses that were just behind the Lord Clyde on Thornton Road. And it was quite unusual because their terraced house that they lived in and that road were through terraced houses rather than back-to-back terraced houses. But they did not think that that was the norm in the area. They just happened to be lucky in some respects. They rented the house. And they were part of a family of 7. They lived in the area from 1949 to 1957. And then towards the end of that time, the slum housing in the area was starting to be demolished. And they were moved, the family was moved to the new Beldine estate in Ollerton, which will have been shiny and brand new. And so lovely. So, go on.
Still is. So the dream.
The things they remembered in the area, there was a cafe, there were shops, pub, this pub, the Lord Clyde, blacksmiths, a scrapyard near where they lived.
Yeah, the scrapyard. I know the scrapyard.
Mills in the area as well. So so as I said, their house was surprisingly a through terrace rather than a back-to-back, and they had a bathroom, but they didn't think that that was normal. That was just that particular row of houses that they lived in. There was no electricity supply though. They had gas mantles for light, they had a coal fire. They said that it was very quiet, there was very little traffic on Thornton Road, and they remembered the trolley buses running on there. And their take on people, although they were very young at the time, people in the area were friendly. There was some story, which I'm afraid I can't remember all the details about. A young man though trying to mug one of the daughters of the family, and then their father came out, and I think he might have been carrying a carving knife or something. So I don't think the guy ever went anywhere near them again after that. But one thing that they said was they never remember anybody calling the area Goitside. And similarly, when we did the research on Longlands, we found that by the post-war period, people didn't call the area Longlands. They'd call it Chain Street or Westgate or something like that.
I've also noticed Chain Street flats.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
that time of the offer.
It seems as though after the 60s, very little really changed in the area, except I suppose the decline of industry in the area. Oh, sorry. So many of the old mills became empty because of the decline of the wool textile industry in Bradford. It's not that the wool textile industry has declined overall, is it? It's just it's moved, and obviously there's been more mechanisation and so on. It always surprises me though that like Salt Mill was still running into the 80s, wasn't it? I think. Industry starts to disappear in the area. Buildings are left empty. Of course, a lot of them become derelict. You end up with squatters. You end up with drug dens and so on. And we've had lots of fires as well in recent times. There's been a lot of mill fires in Goitside. More recent times, Bradford Council has designated the area as a conservation area, and there's a lot of the buildings which have now got listed status. But Goitside is on Historic England's list of heritage sites which are in serious decline. It's regarded as an area where there is severe danger of lots of heritage just disappearing. And they are being a lot more flexible then, because if something's got listed status, you have to get planning, but then you also have to get listed planning permission as well. And as I think at one time they would have probably been quite dogmatic about what you could do with a listed building. In circumstances like this, I think there is a bit more flexibility now. They just want them to be saved. They don't just want to disappear, basically. So, in the 90s, there was something called the Goitside Partnership that was set up. And interestingly, it wasn't anything to do with the council when it started. It was a business-led initiative. So it was local businesses in the area that decided that they wanted something doing that would start regeneration in the area. It's interesting because in Little Germany it was exactly the same. It was a body called the Little Germany Urban Village Company which really started off Little Germany becoming a place for city centre living, which had connections with the Bradford Chamber of Commerce. Bradford Council got involved in it late in the day, really.
Jumped in the shirt too.
Basically, yeah, they wanted to take credit, I would say. So yes, it was a partnership of businesses. There were residents as well involved, but it was primarily driven by businesses. And it later became a company called the Goitside Development Trust. It did a lot of research about the area. It produced a strategy. It wanted to turn the area into a sort of urban village. So it wanted Silsbridge Road above some house to become a bit like a high street for an urban village, and for there to be more housing in the area, if you like, or conversion of a lot of the old mills into housing. But also more commercial organisations in the area as well. It came up with a bit of a master plan, and it wanted Bradford Council to adopt it as its planning policy. The idea that if someone then applied for planning permission to do something in the area, they would have to measure that against their master plan. But after a lot of umming and ahhing, all the council would do is adopt it as guidance. So it's something called something called supplementary planning guidance, which meant they had to consider it, but they didn't actually have to be swayed by it in the end without they made a decision. So there were some initiatives. So there have been more flats and apartments built sort of in the area from mills and other industrial buildings being renovated. But a lot of that has been student accommodation, which then I would say brings with it a different set of problems, really. I worked at Bradford College for a while, and I was actually surprised because we ran degree courses that we did have students who were in student accommodation who had moved to Bradford to do degrees from wherever, and some of the tales about what went on in these blocks was, well, it wasn't somewhere that I would want to stay anyway, even just for a year. part of my studies. And that the other side of that as well is that if you have a transient population, things like students, you have less long-term residents in an area, and you need the long-term residents to develop that loyalty and community and people wanting something to change in the area. So that some initiatives haven't been very successful. There was Woolston House on Grattan Road, which was like a managed workspace for different businesses, but it ended up going bankrupt, unfortunately. I don't know whether they had actually done their research properly to see if there was a demand, or whether they were pricing things properly, or they were offering what people wanted. But it went into administration. And unfortunately, the Goitside Development Trust itself became dormant in 2015. The people who were leading it, who were mostly business people, moved away from the area, and so they didn't really have any particular reason to carry on being involved that heavily. And earlier this year, the business was struck off, so it no longer exists anymore. It's like voluntary liquidation, basically. Well, I hope that's been of some interest. And if you come to any of my other sessions, then I'll see you in the new year and have a good Christmas break.